they're talking about, some of this, hybrid warfare kind of stuff. Well, you see the British doing that right now. The British have been practicing hybrid warfare. Who do you think did the drone attack against the Russian bases? The Ukrainians? It was a British plan, British run with a Ukrainian footprint. Who do you think's doing these underwater drone attacks against Russian shadow fleet? The Ukrainians? No, it's the SBS, the Special Boat Service, and MI6. The British have been doing this all along. They already are doing preemptive hybrid attacks, and the Russians know this. Putin spoke because I think he was just frustrated and angry about this. I think he just had basically had enough of stupidity. It's like, anybody would when you just see somebody behaving stupid. At some point in time, you just snap and say, look, I'll blow up your house if you want to do this. But the fact is, NATO can do nothing, literally nothing. And the Russians know this, but they're prepared. I just ask people to do the basic math. If you're producing, 1,000 drones a day, and you're only using at max 550, where's the other 450 go a day? They've been producing these now for several months. Please understand, Russia has 100,000 drones minimum that can darken the skies of Europe anytime Russia wants it to. There's not a damn thing Europe can do about it. They don't have any air defense, nothing. So that's why I think Putin's pretty confident that if you want to play this game, Russia's ready to play right now, he said. Notice he didn't say we have to mobilize, we have to do anything right now, because it's not going to be the war that you think it's going to be. It's literally going to be 30,000 drones going into Europe, a day for a week. That's 210,000 drones. There is no defense, so nothing's going to shoot them down. I can pick 210,000 points of impact and wipe Europe off the face of the earth. So this is the kind of stupidity that NATO is dealing with right now. And this is the kind of stupidity the United States just is avoiding. That's why we're not talking to them. Because what's there to talk to? These are morons. Kelly Callas says, nothing she says makes sense. Literally. Macron, nothing he says makes sense. Nothing any European says makes sense. Even the head of this military committee, he doesn't make sense. The Europeans are just there being nonsensical, doubling down on stupid. And the Russians, the United States are just going, ignore them. And now, like spoiled children, they're pounding the table even harder, trying to be heard. At some point in time, Europe will wake up and realize that they've cut themselves out, that they have no influence, and that things are going to happen. They're going to have a profound impact on Europe. I mean, I love it. They're so proud because now they passed a law that says we will never use Russian gas and oil. Good luck. But you are, and you will, and you're just stupid.
You have been.
You have been, and you always will be. So Europe's just nullified itself. It's not a serious actor anymore.
You said that none of the things that Macron is talking about makes sense. Here is what he said about the corruption in Russia, Scott.
That you never hear of corruption in Russia because there's no independent body to look into it. So when we are supporting war efforts, it is important that we are very demanding and that we ensure that people are held accountable. But the fight against corruption works because there are investigations and decisions made. But what is deeply concerning is that you never hear of corruption in Russia because, again, of the way the system has been put in place and created.
Never heard. I don't know. Putin did arrest a governor of Kursk for corruption. I believe there have been a number of deputy defense ministers arrested for corruption, generals arrested for corruption, lieutenant governors arrested for corruption. I mean, the Russians, especially since this, after the mobilization, the mobilization of 300,000, I mean, people need to understand that was it wasn't intended to be, but it became a revolutionary process, because what happened is Putin said 300,000 mobilization, all the system that we've been putting money into, infrastructure. I get reports every year that says this is what we're ready to do. Let's execute. And some of them did it, because believe me, not everybody in Russia is corrupt. And many people went, boss, we're all ready. We receive them. Here's their uniforms. Here's their guns. We take them to the training center. Boom. But there are other areas where they're going, guys are waiting around going, there aren't any uniforms to give you. And the guns we're giving you are all rusted because we didn't maintain them and all this stuff. Why? Because the head of the military commission took that money and bought himself a mistress and bought himself a house and all this stuff. They're all in jail. Russia went in and went, oops, removed them. They're in jail. They're prosecuted. It wasn't done in secret. They were arrested in public, put up there in public, stripped of their medals, stripped of their orders, and put in jail where they're serving time. I'm not saying that corruption doesn't exist in Russia. It does. The Russians admit that it does. But the idea that you don't hear about it because Russia doesn't investigate. No, Russia investigates corruption like you wouldn't believe. Putin he inherited a mess. Again, one thing people don't understand is just how bad Russia was when Putin took over, and the level of corruption. I mean, the decade of the 90s, and this is corruption that was facilitated by the United States and the West, as it was done on purpose to strip Russia of its wealth. And you had these oligarchs who just basically took over entire state enterprises. And Putin realized that, you can't just come in and make this all disappear. And so he cut a deal with the oligarchs. You can continue to have your proceeds, but from now on, you have to pay your taxes, and you have to invest back into Russia, and you have to do things to the benefit of the Russian state. You don't just strip wealth away. We have to employ people. We have to build things. And, one by one, he did it. And if somebody, said no, I mean, I think it was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, said, nah, I'm going to challenge you politically. Well, he was arrested, charged, because every single one of them was corrupt. So it was easy to point how corrupt he was and how criminal he was. And he went to jail, and then Putin released him because the other oligarchs were like, oh, come on now. He didn't really know. They let him go. Now he works for MI6 in London, running political operations against the Russians, using his billions of dollars to finance it. There's other people like that too out there, but gradually they're being winnowed out. Russia is less reliant upon the money of the oligarchs. One of the greatest gifts the West ever gave to Vladimir Putin was the decision to sanction the oligarchs at the beginning of this, because they suddenly weren't of use to Vladimir Putin anymore. He said, all your money's been overseas, been seized. Too bad, so sad. Everything now, the new laws, everything has to be reinvested in Russia. No wealth can leave Russia. And you just see a boom taking place. Is there corruption? Of course. Anytime you have this much money running around, and Russia's a big country, a lot of reliance on local government, there's corruption. But it's, Russia doesn't sit there and allow it. And it's being winnowed out. Major anti-corruption campaigns taking place across Russia. So Macron just simply doesn't know what he's talking about, literally doesn't know. But nobody in Europe knows what they're talking about Russia. I mean, we started off by you welcoming me back here. Look, in August, I spent a number of days, 14 days in Russia. I went back for 6 days in October, and I just back 19 days. And I'm talking about, diving in up to my ears, trying to learn about Russia. Gilbert Doctorow likes to believe that I go over there and I'm wined and feted by, the RT and the Russian government and fat retired generals. No, Gilbert, you have no freaking clue what you're talking about. I go over there and I work with the Russians. I talk to the experts. I talk to the well-connected. I talk to the people on the streets. I don't stay in 5-star hotels. I stayed in actually a very modest 3-star hotel. Very nice, very clean, but definitely not the Metropole. This is how you learn about Russia: the good, the bad, the ugly. The good news for Russia is that most of it's good. Russia is doing quite well. The bad news is there's some ugly. There always is. And the other bad news is the war is creating changes in Russia that aren't good for Russia in the long term. But Russia, this is the reality of conflict. This is why Russia wants this war to end. And they want it to end decisively, so you don't have forever wars, so that they can reverse all this and get Russia back on track to, being fully functional. But you can't learn about this long distance. I mean, even, like today, I can go through, thanks to Google Translate, because according to Gilbert Proctor, I only speak 3 words. Well, Gilbert, blin, mat, that's 3. And I just told you, basically, what I said, Gilbert. And I could go on and on, because I know a lot of soldier slang. So I can go on. I know a couple hundred words of soldier slang to tell you where to go, Gilbert. But I can also, say things polite in society. I can converse in Russian, not fluently. It's ugly, but I got it down. But the point is, thanks to Google Translate now, you can actually get a hold of these documents, these Russian language documents, and do the deep digging. But if you don't know what to look for, if you're just reading a document and you don't understand how to put it in a perspective or a context, it can be difficult. By going to Russia, by talking to the economists, by talking to the diplomats, by talking to the military officers from the rank of general on down, you're able to navigate your way through these sources and start to get a bigger, broader picture of the complexity of Russia. It's a very complex country, but it makes sense. There's an inherent logic to Russia, and this is what I do. This is I'm an old intelligence officer, so I'm not a journalist. I don't approach a problem from a journalistic standpoint. I approach it as an intelligence problem, which means I need to have a full fundamental understanding of the issues so that, all outcomes can be considered. And that's how I approach Russia from the standpoint of an intelligence problem. I build a collection management plan. I'm not spying on them, but I know the resources available to me, and I use these resources to collect data. Then I assess this data, and then I put forward a thesis, and I test the thesis, and then I modify the collection requirements until I get enough information to where I can say I feel comfortable making the following assessment about Russia. Am I right? Sometimes, a lot of times. Am I wrong? Sure. But the beauty of being wrong is when you see, as a journalist, when you're wrong, you try and say, well, we were lied to, we were misinformed. As an intelligence officer, you say, I got it wrong. Why did I get it wrong? Where do I need to get different sources of information? Did I not understand the information that I had? And you work the problem till you get it right. My job is to get it right. My job is to know the truth about Russia. And that's why I can safely say, when I hear Macron speak, I'm going, he has no idea what he's talking about. None whatsoever. So far removed. Everybody in Europe, they don't speak knowledgeably about Russia. And only now, when you see, Steve Witkov start to talk about Russia, he's not a Russian area specialist, but he has a deeper understanding of Russia because he's actually having these in-depth conversations with Kirill Dmitriev. He knows more about Russia than all the so-called Russian experts that, populate Stanford, Georgetown, Harvard, or live in Belgium. All these people that, speak the language fluently, their beautiful language. My God, they can order great wine because they speak Russian beautifully. But they don't have a freaking clue about the reality of Russia because they've distanced themselves from that reality.
The other day, Scott, we were talking about, together with Larry Johnson and Paul Kirk-Roberts, we were talking about how Russia could have, dealt with the situation in Ukraine in a different manner. And we had 2 different ideas on the part of Larry. Larry said, as Poon just mentioned in the video that I put, I played for you, he said that the case of Ukraine is totally different from the case of Europe. If we go against Europe, we're going to be totally different. But the point that Paul was making, it was, why did Russia not intervene in 2014? And do you think that Russia, you've mentioned when Putin came to power in 2000, it was a huge mess in Russia. The country was passing away during those days. And there was an internal conflict with Chechnya in those days, which was, the country was involved, the Putin administration was dealing with that until 2010. it shows that how situation was somehow, it was impossible for Russia to intervene in Ukraine in 2014. What is your understanding of that?
You know, the Russian military was fundamentally broken when Putin came into power. They fought a war in Chechnya, but it was fought with blood and guts. I mean, there was no sophistication. It was ugly. It was bloody. And, you know, that's when the Russians start to make the transition away from this conscript military, which they inherited, to what they call contract soldiers. But the number of professional soldiers was very minimal, and they were all sort of jammed into Chechnya because you can't go to war, fight that kind of war with conscripts. Conscripts don't want to die. You get the hardened guys who are taking the money, but these guys weren't, you know, they didn't have the training. The way they fought is the way they learned through the school of hard knocks, fighting the Chechens, and it was brutal. It was ugly. No law of warfare. It was just killing. And they prevailed. They were able to negotiate a peace with the Chechens. Akhmat Kadyrov and Vladimir Putin were very successful in this regard. The story of Chechnya is one of the great success stories that the West will never know and understand, because we mock it. We don't have a clue. Go to Grozny. You'll see a city reborn. Go to the country. Talk to the Chechens. You know, they are all in on being Chechen and also all in on being part of the Russian Federation. They are Russian citizens. It's sort of a miracle that people don't understand. But the military was broke, because again, the skill set that you get by carrying out this brutal war is not transferable. So even though the Chechen war ended, the Russian military still had a system of recruiting, training, organization that was linked to Soviet times. And this was played out in 2008 in the short war with the Republic of Georgia. And remember, Russia didn't start that war. That war was started when Saakashvili sent in, you know, several brigades of U.S. trained, NATO trained forces and attacked the Russian peacekeeping garrison while they were asleep, killing some Russians. So the Russians mobilized their military resources in North Ossetia, and they came down through the Roki tunnels into South Ossetia, and they fought the Georgians, and they won through sheer mass. But if you look at the reports, you know, it's sort of cool being a U.S. Marine, because, you know, the Marines did train several of these brigades in small unit tactics. And these guys knew how to shoot, move, and communicate. And the Russians were saying, you know, tactically, these Georgians, they're light infantry, they're amazing. They're moving tactically in a way that we can't match. So we just pull back and blow the crap out of them with artillery, and that's it. But they were very impressed with the tactical proficiency of the Georgian forces and the ability to communicate too. The Georgians communicated more effectively than the Russians did. The Russian response was very lumbering, plodding. And there was a recognition at that point in time within the Russian circles that if Russia had gone up against a NATO-trained force, the Russian military may not do so well, because you know, these were Georgians, you know, who could operate tactically to the NATO standard, and they were outperforming the Russian counterparts. So the Russians at that point in time began to rethink the entire way they did the military, and they were moving forward on that. By 2014, they had some improvements, but not enough. They still, you know, it takes a lot to break down your military and start all over from the ground up. So in 2014, the Russians were able to use some special forces that were, very proficient. But, you know, the idea that they were going to come pouring in with massive conventional army, no, they weren't ready for that yet. So that's one of the reasons why. Two, it was a whole legal thing. I mean, Putin just wasn't inclined to take over Ukraine. They were compelled to do something in Crimea because the Ukrainian nationalists made a power move on Sevastopol, sent a trainload of these Banderists there, and the Russians said that ain't going to happen. And so there's a grassroots movement inside Crimea, Sevastopol, that was backed by Russian special forces, little green men who came in and seized communications, and Crimea became Russian. They solved that problem right off the bat. It was more difficult in Donetsk and Lugansk. Some of the, there was some legal problems here. People tend to forget that Sevastopol was a federal district in Russia. It was ruled by Russian law and a whole bunch of other stuff. So Crimea was a unique set of circumstances. Donetsk and Lugansk were purely Ukrainian. So how do you make little green men appear? So that's where Wagner came in. Utkin came in. He call signed Wagner. He was a GRU special forces guy. And so he created paramilitary teams. He organized them, and they went in and they began to help facilitate, the military capabilities here. But that's not a conventional force. When in 2014, when the Russians did bring their forces in, they brought in, tanks. I forget the brigade number, 9th or 5th or something, but they brought them in, and there was this big battle at the Baltsovoy or something of that nature in Donetsk, where the Ukrainian army was surrounded by the Russians and they were going to kill them all. And that's when Merkel pleaded with Putin to spare the Ukrainian army, and Minsk came into being, and Putin agreed, because he wasn't out for, taking over Ukraine. He just wanted the rights of the Russians to be respected. But the Russian army at that point in time still was not up to speed. The Russians weren't even up to speed in 2022. They had certain capabilities in place, but what we saw, and again, I had a fascinating interview with a guy who had fought in Donetsk. I just got to look at the clock here, make sure we've got about 20 more minutes. I'm sorry, we got about 10 more minutes. He fought with the Donetsk People's Republic's army, since 2014. So in 2022, when the war started, he called up his fellow DPR people, because it was still an independent nation. He said, "Watch, here come the big boys. They're going to teach us something." And he watched the Russian army roll in, and then he saw the Russians go forward, and he went, "Don't do that. Gone. Don't do that." And he said, they don't know what they're doing, because they had never fought a war. It was a peacetime military, and they're going in there, and the Ukrainians, who had been fighting since 2014, knew a couple things, and they were taking them out. They were ambushing them, and the Russians had to learn. But the thing is, the Russian military is one of the quickest militaries in the world in terms of adapting to lessons learned. They have and this is the benefit of the restructuring of the military. Remember, massively reforming the military. What happens is you create these institutions of higher learning, higher education, these academies at every level, and you rotate people in. Doctrine is developed and then spit back out to the training grounds, which they begin to train. And as you learn your lesson, now in peacetime, the lesson learned process is extended over a period of time. In war, it's instantaneous. Battalion of tanks went out there and got ambushed. What happened? They screwed up. They needed this, that, and the other thing. Okay, bring in the survivors, go in, brief, think about it, brainstorm, new doctrine, train, and then 8 weeks later, you've got a new doctrinal change. How do you think the Russians won the summer of 2023 counteroffensive? Again, how they beat the Ukrainians, who spent the whole fall and winter training in Grafenvor under the observation and control of the United States and NATO. How did the Russians win? Because they had a Russian general named Romanchuk, who was with the 58th Army coming in from the south, and they pulled him out of his job fighting. They sent him to the General Staff Academy, and they said, "Your job is to rewrite Russian defensive doctrine." And he did, took all those lessons, rewrote it, and then they said, "Now take that doctrine and go down to the place where Zaluzhny said he was going to attack and implement the doctrine." And Romanchuk came in and built doctrinal defenses that kicked the snot out of NATO's trained Ukrainian forces. They didn't get anywhere. They were slaughtered, wiped out. This is how the Russians are. Today, the Russian military today is so finely tuned, so fine. This concept of meat tactics, you don't know what you're talking about. The Russians don't, when I trained, we had fire teams, squads, the platoons, and companies. Russians, they talk about 3, 6s, and 9s. You go into a 3-man assault team, there's 3 more to back you up, 9 to come in and consolidate, and then you move forward. You don't, the day of, human wave assaults is done. Drone warfare won't permit it. The Russians, the command and control, the communications that are taking place today, they absolute control. They will control a 3-man assault team. They will have a couple of drones overhead. They're talking to them. They're, come in. Ukrainian soldier to your left. Okay, see the mound. Stop. Okay, he's not looking. Turn. Shoot. Boom. Kill him. Okay, stop. Throw a grenade over that hill. Boom. Okay, no, you didn't get him. Pull back. Boom, 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 boom. They're directing these guys overhead, and then they say, hold up. Then they bring in a support team with their combat drones, and they bam, 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 hit it with drones. Meanwhile, other drone units are suppressing the Ukrainians' ability to respond 20 kilometers out. Electronic warfare. It's all drones. Everything is drone warfare today. Nothing happens without drones, and the Russians do it better. I talked to a drone commander. He, I said, who's better at this, the Ukrainians or the Russians? He said, overall, the Ukrainians still have an advantage. They're very good at this. That's something for a Russian drone commander to say, Ukrainians are very good at this. But then he said, we've learned everything, and now we can match them in most tactical applications, but we can overwhelm them. They can't. The problem with the Ukrainians is they're good, but they can't sustain it. So the Ukrainians can come in and project their drone wall there for a period, but then the Russians come in and they become very good at taking down the Ukrainian command and control. They identify who's operating, and then they kill them. Iskander missiles used to be carefully hoarded resources. You take a command post, maybe a logistics thing. Today, a Iskander missile, you get a 5-man Ukrainian drone team, bam, it's hit instantly, no waiting, no nothing. They're just blowing them up, killing most dangerous job for the Ukrainians today is their drone warfare units. They're just being slaughtered. The Russians dominate the battlefield, and that's because of their adaptability. So